I'm an assistant wargaming specialist with the Center for Applied Strategic Learning. Before we get started, and just to give everybody else a few minutes to continue to trickle in, we want to get to know you all a little bit better. So, can I get a show of hands of who would consider themselves a gamer here? Who would consider themselves principally a video gamer? Tabletop? RPG? Minis? Okay, awesome. How many of you, and this is also important for us, how many of you currently work in the game design or gaming field? How many of you currently work for the US government? DoD? Excellent. And any lawyers in the room? All right, excellent. Even better. So, I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Jamison, and I'm a Wargaming assistant.
And I'm Ken Kligge. You getting me? Am I loud enough still? Good. I hate myself on microphone, but apparently I have to because we're recording this thing. So my name's Ken Kligge. I'm the acting director for CASTLE, as Scott said, the Center for Applied Strategic Learning, which doesn't actually say much. So it's got a good acronym, though. We like that in DoD. So Wargaming Center, we'll cover it for the most part. If you want to swap your way through CASTLE or Wargaming Center, if you're asking questions later on.
So what this presentation is we're going to go through a series of topics of elements of game design. Things like purpose, format, structure, some of the key axes of mechanics that you can look at. Then we're really trying to reserve a lot of the time to open it up to Q&A to you all to talk through first, hopefully, any kind of questions you have, in particular about what we talked about in the presentation. Then a little broader to talk about questions like how might you game this topic, or how do you see this mechanic working in for this type of purpose, and hopefully kind of dig into some details there. So save your questions for hopefully about midway through the presentation when we'll open that up. And with that, what is a war game? I suspect most of you probably have an opinion on this, and so do we. We take a very ecumenical view of what is a war game. It can be a lot of different things. As you can see, it can be something like people standing astride a big map of the world, moving pieces about, and having a conversation about big strategic choices. It can also be pretty detailed and pretty granular simulations or other virtual models that you might be using. It can also be something that looks a lot like the board games that you'll find next door, or the much more crunchy hex encounter war games that you might have seen at some point. So throughout this presentation, think as broadly as possible about a war game, from something digital to a group of people sitting around a table having a conversation. So when we start looking at designing a war game, purpose is what matters to us. Not the scenario, which we'll get to later, not any neat mechanics, which we'll also talk about later, but the purpose. And in our sort of line of professional wargaming, that can come in a variety of different forms. It can be used to support decision-making, analysis, education, training. Those are kind of the main groups that we'll look at here in this presentation. And wargaming within those is a tool that has some real advantages but also limitations. What we find wargaming works best for is less structured problems. So if you want to look at something analytically, if it's a highly structured, highly complicated, highly technical problem, there's a lot of other analytical tools out there that might give you better results. Or if you want to train somebody how to do a very particular, very technical, hands-on task, a game might not be the best way to teach them. But if you're looking at something in that space of human decision-making, then that's where wargaming really shines. A couple of the other elements that we find when we're looking at sort of what is the purpose that somebody wants to achieve with a game suitable to the tools that we can offer. We can't predict the future, but we can help examine it and explore potential paths. We can give participants a chance to dynamically interact with a situation or a series of dynamics or trends that they want to look at. So as we kind of look at what that purpose is, whether it be educational or analytical, we want to try to refer back to that for every design decision that we make throughout the process. And now sometimes these are explicit and implicit. So you might have a game where and sorry, I'm going to take a step back here and also kind of give some context. As game designers, we normally don't have the topic of the game. We just don't wake up in the morning and say, hey, we want to design a game on critical infrastructure defense from cyber attacks. Clients come to us, sponsors come to us and say, hey, I have a problem. I need to figure out what steps I can take to make our electrical infrastructure more resilient to cyber attacks. And then we work with them to figure out if what they're looking at is suitable for a game, is something that we can apply the right techniques to, and then how we can apply those techniques and what that might look like. So that person who came to us and said, hey, I need to defend the electrical grid from a cyber attack, might say that that's his objective, that he wants to figure out how can we bring together the different agencies, different private sector companies, different utilities that all kind of play into that. That might be the explicit objective he has, but maybe the implicit is to find out what those companies' limitations are in this field. So sometimes there can be implicit and explicit objectives to the purpose of why somebody's running a game. So some might be left unstated, and that's really kind of one of the hard parts for us as we move through game design, is to figure out what exactly that is. Once we have figured out what the purpose of our sponsor is in that game, we can then actually move in and begin applying research and analysis to figure out the problem and how we can put that into a game. So we're going to kind of transition and talk a little bit about one of our games as an example of how some of these purposes can differ and some of the different tools used in it.
Okay, so as we transition to this point, legally speaking, I'd be remiss if we didn't give a standard disclaimer. The views represented on this panel don't represent the National Defense University, the Department of Defense, the U.S. government, or God. The jokes don't get better. You can smile. Chuckles are appreciated. But in all seriousness, the reason I want to put that out there now as we transition to scenarios is because everything that we do at the National Defense University, which educates mid-career and senior level military officers, civilian senior leaders, and some international partners, is done basically under the auspices of Chatham House rules. So while I'm going to probably push some boundaries of Chatham House and what's been said and done in the past, I figure that disclaimer is probably useful. So Shrouded Horizons. One of our more interesting, if not most interesting, exercises from my perspective. I've been there 17 years, and for the most part, what we look at are real-world problems using real-world countries in either a current day or reasonable extraction of a potential future. So what a lot of people might call a wicked problem. And so in 2007, I believe it was, they tend to blend together the years, the U.S. government came to us, specifically an element within the White House, and said, we'd like to look at mass atrocity prevention and what our policy is regarding it and how we actually do this better. Which is kind of interesting and a little daunting, and it's not altogether unfamiliar to me that there's a little bit of irony to say that our best game, our most exciting game, deals with mass atrocity prevention. If I ever forget the word prevention, also disclaimer, just add prevention after I say atrocity. We're not actually conducting training on how to commit them. Big old disclaimer. So, really interesting. And so, as we were developing it, the lead designer came to me and said, we've got a problem. Every time we put it in a country, it ends up being a discussion of what our U.S. policy is in that country where an atrocity may be occurring. Okay, so pick the typical ones. Rwanda. Yep, we're having a discussion about Rwanda and not about the mass atrocity that could be going on and how to prevent it. All right, well, put it in a country where it makes absolutely no sense that they'd have a mass atrocity going on. Pick Australia, Brazil, doesn't really matter which. Oddball country that is pretty homogeneous, at least in terms of population. Somewhere the Brits didn't completely muck up the map, and try it again. And it came out the same way. And so, okay, how do we solve this? Well, it came down to, let's make up a country and its history. And candidly, I was rather reticent to do it because I don't like making things up. I'd prefer to deal with reality. But it was the only way we found that that allowed us to actually have the discussion of the prevention itself. And what that's actually done, and where this segues into the slide, is it's given us the ability to modify and adjust as we see fit for these last 12 going on 13 years for different purposes, with different rule sets, for different audiences. And so the only thing that's fundamentally rigid, and we'll talk more about rigid versus flexible a little bit later in, but the only thing that's hard in the can, so to speak, that we can't change is the videos we've shot. So videos are very expensive to shoot, as I'm sure most of you can appreciate. We bring in, for the most part, and particularly for this exercise, we brought in real-world professional actors and newscasters. We gave them the script. They read the script on camera. We found all the B-roll to put in behind them. We developed all the chyron and crawl that helps amplify the script and make the story real. And they cost about $55,000 in 2007. So, yeah, we're not going to reshoot those, which creates some challenges in how we've adapted the game. Sometimes we just don't use the videos and we go from there. The flexibility comes in when we're looking at the map. So basically, we took a segment of the globe, removed all the lines that were drawn by the Brits and every other colonial power in that region, and twisted it around 180 degrees and redrew the map. We can put different characteristics in. We can make them Francophile. We can make them a former British colony. We can make the neighbor heavily invested in any number of things. We can put natural resources in differently as we see fit. And so it's become very effective to trying to get down to some nitty-gritty things, including when do we get involved, how do we get involved, and how do we sell this to our allies, partners, and the U.S. population writ large. What remains wide open is all the roles and interactions and things like that the participants bring to the table. Next slide. Okay, so I talked through part of that because I tend to meander. But when we first looked at another variant of it, for an elective we run, or the university runs, part of red teaming from a DoD perspective is part of the analytical process of strategy development. So walk a mile in the other guy's shoes, so to speak. All right, so how are we going to do that effectively? Well, one of the challenges we have as human beings is putting yourself in other people's shoes. So if I was playing someone representing the government of Botswana, for the record, this isn't modeled off of Botswana at all, it'd be very difficult for me to act like someone from Botswana. I'd be relying on my perspective as an American citizen who may or may not have ever been to Botswana, but I might have stayed at a Holiday Inn Express. And you tend to get some false impressions, which in the educational realm is not necessarily a good thing, because students take those away and think that's gospel. But when you have a fictitious country set in a fictitious surrounding with fictitious neighbors, you can actually craft a history for them that allows them to maybe represent it a little bit better, because they're not bound by the geography that they have in their head. The other main way we use this is for particularly outreach audiences. We have a relationship with a couple of colleges that have DC seminars periodically throughout the year. And for them, they're not mass atrocity experts. So why would I ask them to look at mass atrocity prevention as an expert? So we focus for them on communication. What's it like to negotiate in and amongst yourselves in what we would call the U.S. interagency process? And then how do you get to ground truth and sell that to different audiences through the media? And so that's how we focused it on that. Each group is given slightly different information. Hi, welcome to the real world. And they have to then present that back to a series of officials and amongst themselves to figure out what ground truth is before they figure out how to respond. And I think with that, I'll stop for now.
So all games are subject to resource constraints, to be it for design or execution. So some of these constraints might be money. What does your budget look like? Can you purchase 50 flat screen TVs for this exercise? In our case, probably not. Another is personnel. How many people do you have for your design team? Also, how many people do you have to help execute this game? Space is also a consideration. How many rooms do you have based on, how many rooms do you need? What do you have to work with? What are the types of rooms that are available to you? Also tools and materials that you can use to design these games and also develop them. If it's, more of a tabletop game, what are the pieces that you have available to you to put on the table? And also a big one is time. When your sponsor comes to you, how much time are they allowing you before they need their materials and an execution date? So that can be a big driver in design. So all these constraints shape your available options, and the purpose and objectives of the game drives your decisions within that space when you're looking at the constraints you have and being able to say to the sponsor, here's what we can do for you. And so constraints are really just all about meeting your purpose in the art of the possible. There's also a lot of limitations to wargaming. For one, wargames cannot predict the future. Wargames are used to look at decision making inside of a scenario or a particular set of constraints. Also, they're not good for point-based or single-issue solutions. If you're running a war game, it's probably not going to tell you just how many aircraft carriers you need to make. Also, in games, outputs are only as good as the inputs. If you're lucky, you can have, a great set of minds sitting at the table participating in an exercise. But if your design isn't great, or if you haven't built in a way to collect really good data, then your outputs may not be as good. Also, the unfortunate reality of wargaming is that usually you only get one iteration of a game, and that's heavily based on constraints that you face when designing and executing it. And this isn't ideal, especially for analytical games that are collecting data, but you have to work with what you can do. It's also generally inefficient for optimization problem sets.
So to kind of dive down from that 50,000 foot level, talking about big issues, purpose, constraints, objectives, let's actually start talking about what these games look like. And that starts with format. Now, that is, as Caitlin was just pointing out, heavily built, heavily structured around the constraints. Let's say you have, your sponsor comes to you and says, the people I need to have play in this game, because they're the ones with the knowledge, only have 4 hours available. Congratulations, your game is going to now be 4 hours max. And if you wanted to get maybe 2 iterations, now you're going to have to build a 2-hour game. Or let's say you have, in your ideal world, you would break everybody out into 4-person groups, and they would each have a separate breakout room to go to do some phase of the game, planning the next move, or having private group discussions. But the facility that your sponsor has made available to you, or that you can find, doesn't have breakout rooms. Then you need to start redesigning the game and figuring out how you can either accomplish that in the space you have available or not. So format can range from kind of those practical details to questions of what exactly is the type of information, the level of analysis that you're looking to get out of this game. Is this a game where you are maneuvering forces on some kind of large map, a hex encounter game, that you want to try to get information about the efficacy of different unit combinations, equipment types, and figuring out something like that? Or is this a strategic discussion where you're bringing together a variety of smart people, subject matter experts, maybe people from a given region, to try to pull information out of them through forcing them to have a structured discussion in the context of a scenario? Or maybe this is an educational game where you're trying to impart understanding, help people build their skill set in a particular area by challenging them with a very difficult problem that they need to try to work through and find a solution to. All of these have trade-offs and can be quite large, as we'll see as we kind of start talking about the mechanics that go into making that structure. But first off,
so the other thing that kind of runs through our whole design process is fundamentally who's playing the game. If these are senior officials, as Scott mentioned, I'm not going to get them, we're not going to get them for 3 days of 8 hours each. It won't happen. And I've run games for up to and including the President of the United States, former President, several administrations ago. And that was run on a Saturday for 2 hours in the East Wing. So, yeah, you're not going to get very deep in that. But you're also not going to present read-ahead material to him or her at a very senior level that is basic or what he or she might presume to have better knowledge of than you. So you have to frame what we present in a certain way when you have very senior officials. Now, conversely, if you have students who might not be particularly familiar with the topic, it's probably good to give them a little bit more background data in order for them to have a good baseline walking into the game. Once you know who those people are that are participating, you have to figure out what you want them to do, who you want them to represent. Again, senior officials, they probably are representing themselves. I don't need to tell a deputy assistant secretary of whatever that he or she is now a assistant secretary from Homeland Security, say, if they're a DoD official. It's kind of silly, right? We just bring in all the people we need from those organizations to have that conversation. Conversely, if they're a student, they might not know what a senior Homeland Security official might be responsible for. So then you have to develop a role for them and give them some guidance on that. Are they acting in aggregate or as individual members of that organization? Are you the U.S. government, or are you, again, someone very specific within the government by role? What are the rules that they have to follow, and or if this is a more competitive game where you're trying to balance one side against the other to see what the interaction looks like, do they have set objectives? Are those objectives public or private? They can be both simultaneously. And so you have to work through all of those pieces and parts as you're going through. And then the last thing, although it pervades throughout, much like most of this, as I think we're trying to hammer home, is how do you craft the event such that they have meaningful interaction with it? It doesn't do us very much good as game designers to develop something that's so esoteric that it's really cool for us that no one knows how to interact with. Or I was having a conversation with some indie designers earlier today. I bought Scythe a couple of years ago. It took me 45 minutes to get it set up the first time, and I found out I had one piece left, or missing. Oops. That really sucked, by the way. And so crafting 45 minutes to set up and teach someone how to play a game when you have 4 hours, non-starter. So you have to adapt how you're doing this depending on who's playing.
So rule sets in games kind of exist on the spectrum of rigid versus free. So rigid rule sets look a lot like when you take a commercial game off the shelf and you open it up and there's an instruction booklet in there. A great example of this is chess. Each piece has a particular thing that it can do, particular movement it can make, and the players have specific things that they can do, number of things they can do, etc. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have free games that rely entirely on human judgment. And these can look a lot like open adjudication seminar games. You have people sitting around the table, they're describing, hey, like this is what we want to do. And then you have an adjudicator in the room using their own judgment saying, yes, this is possible, or this is acceptable, this makes sense, I'll allow it. And again, this is a spectrum, it's not necessarily a binary choice. So there are games and exercises that exist kind of in the middle. And a great example of this is Dungeons and Dragons. You have a rule set that kind of governs interactions, but at the same time, players have a lot of free choice in the game. And kind of on the flip side of wargaming, we have something called matrix games that look a lot like that. So players can pretty much do whatever they want in the game. If they can describe it and justify it, then they can do it, and then they roll a set of dice to see if they were successful in that action. So there's kind of three ways of thinking about rules: action, interaction, and information. So these aren't mutually exclusive, but it's a good way to divide them up. So we can just go ahead to the next slide. So rules of action kind of govern what players can do and how they do it. And this is highly format dependent, kind of like I was describing earlier on that spectrum of free versus rigid rules. And it has a lot to do with identifying, inputs and outputs. What are the players putting into the game, and what are they getting out of it as a result? And an important thing here is player agency. These players in a game have to be making meaningful decisions. So what does the rule set allow them to make decisions about? And how does the rule set allow them to make those decisions? What are the constraints that the rules are putting on those players? What are the rules freeing up for the players to do? Go ahead. So moving on to rules of interaction, and this governs how the players at the table communicate and interact with each other. How are they affecting the other players at the table? As far as communication, how are they communicating? When? Are they communicating at all? Is that even allowed? Also, is there resources in the game that the players can trade, or can the players enter combat with each other? And there's also, limits on this. Are the limits being mediated by a controller or a facilitator of the game? Or, again, are they just not allowed at all? And finally, rules of information. So what do the players know and when do they know it? So before the game, what are the players given? What information about the world that they're having to interact with in the game are they allowed to know? Is it a complete set of information or is it incomplete? Are they going to have to make assumptions about the information that they're given? Also, a game board can be a choice in a game. You don't have to have one, and that also has implications for the amount of information that players are given. So for example, Kriegspiel has 3 game boards. So you have a red team, a blue team, and the control team. So the red team can really only see their pieces and maybe, the unit pieces of the blue team based on proximity. Blue team is working on a completely different game board that the red team cannot see. And again, they can see their own pieces, maybe a couple of the red teams based on proximity. And then the control team has all the pieces in front of them, and that's how they are adjudicating. Also, if you have elements like cards, those are great for information concealment, also gaining information. Maybe, a player has a card that allows them to look at the hand of another player, etc. So just some general guidelines and suggestions for mechanics. When you're designing a game, you do want to try and fit the mechanics to the ideas or objectives or purpose of the game that you're designing. What you do not want to do is try to fit the idea that you have into an existing idea or set of mechanics that you have in your head, or maybe fit an idea of a game into an existing one. So that really leads to a lot of complications and you straying away from the purpose of your game. You really want the mechanics of the game to serve the purpose. Getting inspiration from other games that you've played is great. We do that a lot in our job. So we'll try and play as many games as possible and really build up a pool of knowledge of different mechanics that we can then incorporate or work off of or change or manipulate into an entirely different game that we may be designing. So that leads me to mechanical harmony. So as you are pulling the inspiration and mechanics from various games, when you're designing, you really want to make sure that those mechanics interact well with each other. Make sure that, if you are buying a lot of cards as resources, make sure you have enough money left over to maybe play those cards or input those resources somewhere else, for example. Also, balancing mechanics is important. So you really want to make sure that the mechanics aren't underpowered or overpowered, especially if you have a lot of numbers involved with your mechanics. You want to make sure that those numbers work out really well. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're balancing the play for each player. So for wargaming, we have a lot of forced asymmetries in our games at times. For example, I designed this game up there with my colleague called Damned If You Do. It's about water scarcity in the Middle East and how it can affect conflict and regional stability. And not all countries are made equal. That's just how it works. So for example, Syria starts with a lower income. They're in the middle of a civil war. Unfair to Syria, but that's how the real world works. So we have to force that asymmetry into the rules and mechanics of the game. Also, when you are balancing mechanics, it's a good idea to think about replay value. So think about, are your players going to be playing this multiple times? Or in our instance, a lot of the time, our students only play the game one time. That is their first and only exposure to the game. So does replay value really matter there? Also, keeping a game diary is a really great idea. So as you're designing a game, have a dedicated notebook or a dedicated file on your computer that is specifically for your design notes, the thoughts you're having, questions, or things that you're considering putting in that game. So that as the game is developing and you are working out these mechanics, you can go back and say, hey, wait, did I think about that earlier? And what was the decisions that I made and why? And playtesting is so important, especially for board games and tabletop games. When you're having to balance those mechanics a lot, playtesting is crucial to make sure it is balanced, and it is a long iterative process. Playtesting does not happen just one time. For the Damned If You Do game, I think it took us maybe 9 months of playtesting to balance it, and I think all of my coworkers are really tired of playing that game. But that's what it takes to make a balanced game, and you just have to do it, and it's an ongoing process. We're still updating this game to this day.
So once you get through the first, I don't know, whatever that is, 4 or 5 steps that we've talked through, now we get to scenario. The problem with scenario is, I'll start at the bottom of the slide. Humans fundamentally interact with a world, right? So we bump into things, ow, right? We observe things, we touch, see, smell, taste things. And what that has allowed us to do as human beings is have a consciousness, which is cool. But on the other hand, what it does is it forces us into trying to bin everything into some sort of narrative. And so I always use this example. It's made up. I have a friend who's Sri Lankan, so this is why I use it. Someone comes to me and says, I want to build a game on terrorism in Sri Lanka. Cool, the Tamil Tigers were an interesting terrorism group in the 80s, 90s. Why the Tamil Tigers? Well, because I want to talk about terrorism. Got that part. Why? Why them? Well, I want to talk about car bombings. Wrong. Wrong group. Don't want to talk about the Tamil Tigers. So we have to drag people back early and, generally speaking, often away from that cliff of, I want to talk about fill in the blank, to, as Scott mentioned up front, why do you want to do a game? But once we have that fairly well locked down, this is where the creativity comes in. It really defines at least the start of the exercise. What the participants have to deal with inside the constraints that we've talked about previously: time, money, people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't necessarily constrain where they go, though. A lot of that comes up, as we've talked about, in terms of rules and interactions. So a matrix game, for example, you give a very thin scenario, maybe a page or two. Here's the world today, go. And it's really the argumentation of what they want to do, what the counter arguments are, and the judgment of an adjudicator and luck of a die roll that determines what happens next. So in terms of scenario, you have to make sure you're constantly evaluating, particularly in something that's a little more free play, what are the potentialities that a participant or group of participants only seeing and doing this one time will feel, experience, et cetera, to make sure that again, the scenario is driving you back to those objectives.
So to dive a little bit deeper into playtesting after having it listed 3 times in a row on my previous slide. Again, very important to do, and here's some kind of suggestions for how you may go about playtesting a game. I like to have my A team, my B team, and my game team playtesters. Scott is one of my lovely A-team playtesters. He is very nice about his critiques, very gentle with his suggestions, but he also comes up with a lot of great ideas for me to incorporate or to modify in my games. He's also on my B team because he's not afraid to critique it. And also we're a small group of designers, so we have some overlapping roles. And then you have the Break My Team game, and those are the people you probably want to bring in a little towards the end of the first couple iterations of your playtesting, and these people come in with the mindset of, I'm going to find all of the loopholes in your rules, and I will break this game to my advantage. And those people are wonderful playtesters. As terrible as it is to sit there as a designer and have someone basically rip apart your game, they are necessary, and they are wonderful playtesters because they will find what is wrong with your game and let you know that you need to fix it. And that's really what you need. Also, try and have a variety of playtesters. If you have the same group come to the table and playtest your game every time, they'll probably be coming in with the same viewpoints on how to play the game, the same strategies. And that's just not a realistic sample size or audience that will be playing your game. There's going to be a lot of people out there playing it, if you're lucky, and you really want to get a variety of playtesters to better represent the audience that you are trying to target with your game. Also, when you're playtesting a game, don't just watch how the players are playing the game. You also want to listen to them. Listen to how they're interpreting the rules. Listen to how they're interacting with each other or with the mechanics of the game, because that's also very important. And after players have played the game and you're kind of going into commentary session with them, really try to focus feedback, especially if it's not your first iteration of playtesting. So you may go in saying, look, I know these cards probably aren't super balanced. Maybe the costs of the cards are too high. Don't worry about that. I know, and I'm going to fix it. So tell me about, X, Y, or Z instead. And that is really critical for balancing your game a lot better, so you're not just going off on the same tangent every time that you're playtesting it. Also, according to the lovely diagram on the right, build and chop your game. So as you're going through the design process, after you've playtested, you're going back to the design board and you're kind of building up this whole pile of connected ideas and thoughts and mechanics, maybe some leftover artifacts from previous versions of your game. And you really want to pile in as much as you can and see how well it fits, and then take your butcher knife and chop some of it away, because you have to find the balance between representation of reality in your game and what you're trying to get at, and also playability. If the game is too complex, it's going to be difficult for players to play it and enjoy it, or in our case, learn something from it. Also, I mentioned a game diary earlier when you're designing the game. It's also a really great idea to keep a separate playtest diary, just to keep track of comments people have made, what you've added to the game, what you have chopped out. And that's really critical for keeping track of everything and your thought process when players are testing it. Also, it's a great idea to hold off on material development. I kind of learned this the hard way myself, just because I really enjoy design and in-game development and the pieces that go into it. It can be a real waste of time when you're having to, play test like I did for 9 months straight. So really make good use out of your time. Hold off on the materials development, because they will change when you're playtesting and then going back to the design board.
Can I just add one piece on playtesting, particularly with the Break the Game team? One word of caution: gamers. I think most of us raised our hand at the beginning. We're really good at that, and it becomes really annoying as a game designer. Critical, as Caitlin said, but the other group that's really good at breaking a game in the converse way are non-gamers. People that don't interact with these things. You say D20 and they're like, huh? Okay, bring them in too, because they're going to get there and they become the prototypical button masher, if you will. And so it's really important to see both sides of that spectrum when you're trying to break the game.
So, we've thrown a lot of information at you in a very short amount of time, trying to cover any purpose and almost any type of professional game you could design. And we barely scratched the surface. These are a few resources that we definitely recommend checking out if you're interested in learning a little bit more. Pack Sims, nice play on Wargames, Peace Sims, is an excellent blog run by a professor up at McGill University, Rex Brynan. I highly recommend it. It's probably the best place to keep up to date in news and kind of information and opportunities in the professional gaming field. Second, the Connections Wargaming Conference, which this summer will be down in Quantico, Virginia, from August 3rd through the 7th. It's free and open to the public. If you're interested in learning a lot more about wargame design, it's a fantastic conference. And then lastly, if we haven't completely killed your interest in us, you can learn more about us at our web address there. So with that, we want to transition to Q&A. I'm going to push the slide back, so if anybody wants to keep writing down the web addresses or anything, feel free. But I'd like to open it up for Q&A about what we talked about, or just about kind of anything you all have interest in. Yeah.
So I've come into Wargames contact with them in the business setting, but one of the critiques I've both seen and heard from my colleagues is that what they don't typically do well is like the multi-move game. So oftentimes we do these to try to inform a set of business decisions, but it's like you'll get to maybe one good smart decision, but it's a decision everyone else will see you making way up well ahead of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have any good advice for kind of focusing on those games and help get you to, as well as you can, not predicting the future per se, but being less predictable yourself or being predictable and intelligent at the same time?
Maybe I'll start. We haven't had that question before. It's a great question, so I'll probably meander a little bit. Scott, feel free to smack me if I go too far afield, or you guys raise your hand if I completely bore you. So one of the things I do when I'm not a professional wargamer is I drink beer. And so as part of that, I've gotten to know several breweries and brewery owners, and one large brewery approached me at a dinner with the owner one night and said, "We're trying to become bi-coastal, and is there anything you can do to help us try to figure out how to gain market share?" Sure. There's going to be some limitations on that. One, you can't technically pay me because I'm a federal employee, and conflicts of interest abound, and I'd have to get a lawyer to say it's okay. But I work for beer. And so, okay, you'll want me to sign an NDA because, I'm going to need to see all of your books and really understand your process and your development, your cycle of how you brew beer to how you get it to market, and then how you market it within the market. But it was a finite issue, right? So how do we gain market share when the company was unicoastal? Basically, all you would get was one or two of their beers on the opposite coast. Now you can get almost all of them on either coast or anywhere in the middle. And they were originally thinking about it from a logistics perspective. But what we found before we shuttered the program for lots of different reasons was it's not the logistics. Yeah, they're saving money. That was a great reason to go bi-coastal. But branding was their issue. Everyone knew this beer from this brewery. Now you're telling me they have 43 that I can try? Oh my God, it's overload. And so, again, kind of meandering back to maybe your question, when you're working with them, I think it's about trying to not bite the whole elephant at a time. Let's take one small piece. Market share, great, okay. Then let's take another bite on something else. And then if you can get them to pay, it's even better, right? But if you can get them to pay for 2 or 3 or 4 little pieces, and you can do good analysis on those pieces and develop a report that says, here's how all these pieces fit together, I think you're on a pretty good path. No pun intended. The challenge of multi-step, though, is if you're trying to do that with business executives, they've got a whole team around them. It's for us, it's sort of like working with senior officials. They have a whole team around them, helping them understand the problem, giving them the data that they need. Sometimes you need to kick those people out of the room. I was briefing a 2-star who was facilitating a game for us about a dozen years ago. And every time I was trying to tell him why we were building the game this way and how I needed him to facilitate it for us, his people would jump in and say, oh, and it's really important that, and I finally looked at them and I said, get the hell out. The general looked at me. I said, no, I'm serious. I'm not briefing you anymore, and you're not facilitating anymore if you don't get them to leave, because right now I'm in charge. It could have been career suicide. I'm still here, so I guess it worked out okay. Maybe that's more a choice of knowing the individual as opposed to anything else, or maybe it's just dumb luck that the game worked out okay. But if you can get those stray voices out, you can maybe get them through a little bit further in the game.
And then to kind of tack on at the end, kind of coming from a different angle, if it's a multi-step exercise and you're kind of stuck at that first step and they're just doing everything predictably, and then you don't have time for anything else, or, you know, people just can't attend past that deadline or something, what you can do is build in an assumption at the start of that exercise, and that assumption would be their predictable answer. So then when you're starting the exercise, that's already been done. They're no longer talking about that. So then you can just move on and have them focus on the things that you wanted to get to further on down the timeline of the exercise.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Any challenges with the people moderating the matrix style game thing called them, having to be a massive subject experts at what they're doing?
Yeah.
It seemed like hugely challenging to adjudicate.
So,
That DMs guys.
yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and I think one that we as very generalist game designers run into a lot, since we often get called in to facilitate a lot of these games. So there's a real balance between having subject matter expertise as a facilitator and sometimes being completely subject agnostic. So I'll kind of address you in the specifics of a Matrix game and then go a little broader. In a Matrix game, to go a little bit into kind of the methodology of it, players have an opportunity to say the action that they want to do and what effect they want it to achieve. So I'm going to conduct an information operation campaign to shape public opinion about my country in this country that is in the scenario we're discussing. And then they go a step further. And for those of you that play or are familiar with D&D, this is the part that it kind of differs. In D&D, you know, you just want the people to tell you, this is what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it. In a Matrix game, it goes further and asks you, well, why are you going to be successful at doing that? So it's the argument that normally the DM's like, okay, I gotcha. You don't need to tell me why your character can do this. I'm the DM, I'll figure that out. In a Matrix game, you actually want the players to articulate that understanding of the scenario, of their capabilities, of its relationship to anything else that has happened or is happening in the game. And so in that sense, the players bring the subject matter expertise to that adjudication decision that the facilitator is making. The point I'll kind of just offer on a broader sense is, in a lot of situations, being agnostic of the subject matter can be quite useful for a facilitator. One, you can't be accused of having having an opinion on the subject if you don't know the subject. And in a lot of games where we're facilitating, trying to expose gaps and vulnerabilities, or get people to articulate equities and kind of talk about their own institutional or organizational objectives, we have to be as neutral as we can be. And sometimes you need some understanding to do that, but other times it's often useful to just be able to be like, hey, so, okay, you just mentioned that thing. I don't know about that thing. Why don't you tell me your understanding of it? And even when we do have subject matter expertise, sometimes we still want to go to that step and have the players articulate and sort of expose their own understanding rather than substitute our own.
And then kind of another challenge that goes along with that is, you know, if you are expected to be a subject matter expert when you are adjudicating Matrix games, it's really important for you, for player buy-in. If they don't believe that you're a subject matter expert, or if the way you're adjudicating, you know, in any way suggests to them that you're not, even if you are, you will lose the buy-in of the players. They will not follow the adjudication of the facilitator anymore, and the adjudicator would kind of lose control of the game a little bit. And another solution, if you're not a subject matter expert, is to bring in one. And they will not be a player of the game, but they are just there for the adjudicator to consult and say, hey, this player is making this argument. Does that sound right to you? Is that reasonable? And they'll give you a yay or nay, and then you can then adjudicate from that.
So I've facilitated a series of Matrix games for international audiences now for the past 2 years. And it's in a subject matter I consider myself fairly well versed in. So the converse of that can be true, and it kind of ties in with both what Scott and Caitlin said, where you have to fight your own internal biases. So how I do that is I try to remember that the participants are coming from varying roles and backgrounds from countries not always the U.S. And so they live much closer to the problem than I do. So maybe my bias doesn't matter quite as much. Or if I just can't get around it, they have a fundamental flaw in their thought process or their rationalization of what they're going to achieve and why. And it's not exposed by the other player teams. I'll flat out say, I have a bias, here's what it is, I'm going to try to keep it out, but I'm docking you a point, or at no point in your rambling did this have any sense of a cogent argument, blah, 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 and may God have mercy on your soul. And I think to Caitlin's point, if you've gained that buy-in with these individuals participating, they'll let you do it. Maybe not every time, but you probably in a 2-day game get it 2 or 3 times that you can say, I have a bias, and here's what it is and why, and here's how that's going to affect your die roll.
Next question. Yeah.
Do any of you have any advice on situations where you're trying to balance player agency and their mechanical choices versus elements of randomness in a game, especially when it comes to like playtesting, trying to find out when is it just bad luck and when is it an actual mechanical issue that needs to be resolved? Do you have any stories related to that?
Yeah, so honestly, we had a little bit of an issue with that when we were playtesting our Water Crisis game. So one of the elements of randomness in that game is, okay, how much of a drought are you facing this year or this turn? And when we first started playtesting, that randomness may just happen to stack up, where players are facing droughts for like the first 5 turns of the game, and it's just impossible for them to do well. And honestly, I think that's just a matter of playtesting as much as possible. You can also, adjust the mechanics. We had considered doing a die roll for droughts instead of just flipping cards in a deck. And that way we could kind of better adjust the granularity of that die roll and put some advantage or disadvantage in it if necessary. Change the numbers a little bit. So, maybe you have on a D10, it's, a 60% chance on a die roll that you won't get a drought, and then 40% you do. And if that's makes it too easy for them, then you can adjust that in the numbers a little bit more too. So being able to identify it is really just a matter of playtesting, and then adjusting it, trying out different mechanics that will work. We went through so many different versions of Damned If You Do, and we finally had to settle on one that worked best, and that was just amount of time in playtesting.
And kind of another piece to that is that kind of decision of where you're going to sit on that rigid to free spectrum. You can create a rigid game with, I think, as you've identified, limited player agency, where they're making decisions, but it's within a very narrowly scoped set of options you have created. And to Caitlin's point, you can play test that to perfection and get it so that, even with a die roll or a card draw, things are going to proceed in a way that you've envisioned.
It's really unrealistic expectation, by the way, to be able to play test it and adjust the mechanics perfectly.
Yes. Yes, assuming the right N. But I think what you've hit on and what we run into in kind of our gaming a lot is if you are looking at the bigger the issue you're looking at, the more choices players expect to have and the more choices you aren't going to be able to anticipate them making. And the more likely that if they sit down to play the game and they're like, oh, I can't do X, this game doesn't make any sense to me.
That happened to me with the water game.
Yeah, so a good example, and I think at some point there was an early version where we were not able to leverage kind of any military options. You know, let's say another neighboring country decided to dam up your river and you weren't getting any water. In an earlier version of the game, there wasn't much you could do about that. And a lot of us were kind of looking at each other and being like, well, I know my country has a real military that could do something about this. And if my citizens are dying of thirst, they would. And that's why in the real world that doesn't happen. So that's kind of, yeah. You've hit on exactly the issue that in game design you have to try to figure out, well, which serves your purpose better. Any other kind of questions? Yeah.
And I was wondering with these kind of wargames, how we can work to enshrine the sanctity of human life in these kind of conflicts. How do you avoid the gamification of these really serious issues?
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. Could you repeat that question? Oh, yeah, sure. So if I caught it, how do we as professional wargamers ensure, and forgive the poor paraphrase, how do we ensure that we work within the bounds of sanctity of human life, and we don't just, oh, nuke them, cool. Well, you said we had a nuclear weapon. That's generally what you're getting at? Okay. So from an educational perspective, that's one of our larger challenges. We had an exercise about 8 years ago where a faculty member said, we really want to have a game that focuses on this, and the bomb needs to blow up in the US, and we're going to attribute it back to a country not particularly friendly to us, having lost control of their weaponry, and some bad actor seized it. Okay, that's a really bad idea. Please don't make us do that. Nope, it has to be that. Okay, why is it achieving the objective? Well, we just have to do it. And eventually the design team, none of which are here today for different reasons, said, okay. And so that happened, which then led to a participant saying, well, if they bombed us, we're going to go bomb Mecca. For the record, the Middle East was nowhere involved in any of the actors in the exercise. It was a religious thing. And a Muslim student from one of our international partners understandably got very offended and got up and walked out, went to their embassy afterwards, and the next day we were getting a phone call being demarched, which, if you're not familiar with that, is very, very bad and generally very painful for the institution that is getting demarched. Not just because, a foreign country is now very upset with you, but because your own senior level organization is now very upset with you. And so what we've had to do is try to also redouble some efforts to get the students to understand outside the gaming context that even though there is academic freedom, there is still good judgment involved. So that's maybe a little far afield from where you were specifically going, but it goes to moral hazard. And the other side of that is, in another example, I've actually stopped the game because someone wanted to do something rather draconian and drastic, and it made no sense to me. And so, okay, stop. Let's go in the hall and figure out why you want to do this, because maybe it makes sense in a competitive game, but you're going to have to define that to me pretty rigidly. It didn't make sense, and so we went back in the room and, okay, the jury will disregard that. Start over. It's really tough, though, because, again, being academics, you're trying to maintain a balance of allowing the students to interact with the exercise how they feel and within the rule set you provide. The other way to do it, so one of the Matrix games I run, several of the countries involved have intercontinental missile capability. Yeah, they don't in the game, because it changes the purpose of the game if they're allowed to launch something, even if it's conventional, across an ocean.
So a lot of it depends on the purpose of the game and the player's knowledge of that purpose. So for our educational games, the students have faculty members in courses, all of this is in the context of a course. And so the faculty member is, at the end of the day, the person that the students are reporting their game back to. And a lot of them understand that if they make decisions that would be unrealistic or implausible, that faculty member is going to call them on it. That's kind of one direction. To talk very briefly in another direction, so that's how we kind of avoid the intentional moral hazard of students making decisions that real policymakers in the real world wouldn't make because of that. And that's really sort of the context of the game. On the other hand, we actually do a lot of our gaming does revolve around questions of ethics and legality. There's one game series that I've been running for a number of years that was designed by a faculty member who came to me and said, I want a Kobayashi Maru. I want my students to have to go into a very particular urban combat situation, and regardless of what they're going to do, their decisions will have consequences they're not going to be happy about, because he wanted to show them the strategic effects of their operational decisions and the difficulty of operating in that particular environment, and why the decision to operate in that environment needs to be taken very seriously and considered deeply before you actually do that, because regardless what you're going to do, there's going to be unhappy consequences for you. Excellent question. Any other questions? Yeah.
First of all, thanks for coming. I came to your panel last year, and I really liked it. And I really
Thanks.
liked it this year. So right now, I just started working for Congress, but on the side, I do a lot of little wargaming and modeling event things for friends and coworkers. And I want to know if you guys do a lot of congressional outreach, or if you work with the Congressional Staff Academy or CRS at all.
Sure.
Because I feel like there's a huge demand for this sort of stuff.
Sure, we can talk more offline later. I'm probably the only one qualified to answer that here with
I can hear what you've said in the past.
Yeah, with no disrespect to my colleagues, because when I joined CASTLE, or its predecessor named organization, in 2002, I got a phone call from a friend that said, hey, we've started a new division over here. Can you work for an asshole for 9 months? And yeah, I can work for anyone for 9 months. But what's the purpose? Well, you used to work on the Hill, and so we'd like you to do some gaming for them. So in that sense, I was the first person hired into this new division, and I was the person that shuttered it in 2010. So brief history, so I don't bore everyone with the minutia. In 2002, basically a year after 9/11, when I joined, it was very easy for us to go up to the Hill and say, Homeland Security exercise, this date, please come. And we'd get about 15 members of Congress, actual sitting members of Congress, sitting with senior executive branch officials, assistant secretaries and above, together, trying to work a problem, oddly, together. And it was a very different time. 2008, 9, 10, what occurred both within the Department of Defense, or was occurring, and what was occurring in terms of legislation on the Hill, kind of gave you the scarecrow effect. Well, some people go this way, and other people go this way. And that's not a political statement. They're just working on different issues, right? 2002, no one was talking about healthcare. People were by then, right? And so the yardstick by which we were measured was number of congressional butts in seats rather than the right butts in seats, and I think that's a dumb metric, so I shut down the program. I currently run a program under the auspices of OSD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I almost got through a whole briefing without using an acronym. Damn it. That brings together the same senior executive branch officials and, when appropriate, either senior staff, personal or professional, or members of Congress. The other challenge is there is a possible perception of lobbying, which the Department of Defense does not do to Congress. We do not lobby, we do not lobby, we do not lobby. I've got a tattoo that says that somewhere. So ebbs and flows, but yeah, I recognize there's a call for it, so we can talk more.
Next question. Yeah.
What is your all's favorite commercial war game?
That's a tough question. So I'll go first unless you guys have a strong opinion.
Pass.
So first let me ask, what do you mean by war game?
Well, I actually changed up the course of this presentation because I like think of a lot of different games as war games. I would say in the traditional sense of what most gamers call war games, so like your Risk, Warhammer 3000,
Okay,
like that.
gotcha. Then digital Europa Universalis 4, if that meets your definition, and then probably tabletop. It's not really a war game, but I'm playing a lot of Terraforming Mars lately.
So I guess digital, I really enjoy playing Civilization. I set it to the military domination win condition, and then I crush them. So that's probably my favorite.
I'm probably not allowed to say pass in reality. So it really depends on my mood. I referenced liking beer earlier. It's kind of the same thing. You know, what's your favorite beer? What day of the week is it? What season of the year is it? App on phone. I've been screwing around a lot with Plague Inc., mainly because I like killing people, but without the actual reality of having to kill people. There goes that moral hazard issue again, right? The more interesting one that I've been messing around with a lot, because a lot of my friends aren't big gamers, is, there's two now, but House of Danger, which is the choose your own adventure one, because you can actually play that relatively easily, single player.
Great. Any other kind of questions? Yeah, all the way in the back.
So, let's say you spend a whole bunch of time, months and months, cultivating this game, building it, playtesting it, and everything like that, and at the end of the day, get nothing out of it. Like, what do you do when your game fails?
Deny, deny, deny.
So failure is an interesting condition. It's something we, as a community, I think as a community, still need to grapple with. And what is What is a failure and what type of failure are we talking about? Because, and I'm just going to try to categorize this in a couple of ways. Is this the players, let's say you gave the players a wicked problem and they failed to solve it. Well, you still, if that was an educational game, there still might have been a lot of learning occurring there. And the players might have understood some facets of it better or now understand what not to do. If that's an analytical game and you're trying to figure out, well, how in the real world do I solve that problem, and your game was trying to help some agency or department solve that, well, maybe the players, again, showed you what not to do, or maybe they didn't, maybe just in the course of their conversations surfaced new issues for you to address that you need to do more research or a different type of analysis on. Maybe rather than a war game, you need to apply some kind of quantitative model to this, and you realize, to go to Ken's example earlier, maybe this isn't a market share problem, this is a logistics problem, and we just need to sit down and do the math on it to figure out how to do this right. So that's players trying to fail to accomplish the task that you set them to. The second example I'll give is, and I think this is probably more what you're talking about, is when the game unravels for one reason or another.
A mechanical failure.
Well, so I'm going to go one level above that and kind of go to the constraints. We were doing a game for a client, very, very senior client who had new responsibilities put upon his office by some new tasking, and they wanted to go out and get a very particular group of senior, very, very senior stakeholders' input on that new responsibility. As we developed the game, we designed it, we came up with some really interesting mechanics on how to do this, and in the course of them trying to set the game up, they realized that these senior high-level stakeholders that they thought were available to them didn't know who they were and didn't know this office at all. And it was an awakening for them that they needed to really redouble their outreach and education efforts with this group of stakeholders that previously they had thought were their core audience and somebody that they could whistle up and fill a room with. So I try to be, despite the world, I try to be an optimist, and I think even in a lot of failures, you can find elements of success, of learning. Worst comes to worst, even in the case of mechanical failure, you'll learn things about the process and how to build the game, design the game, and all of that.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, so just to kind of dig a little bit deeper into the mechanical failure, one of the things that my colleague and I experienced designing the water scarcity game, because she actually came up with a concept and a prototype in 2 days in a game design workshop. So it was very bare bones, and we play tested it when she returned from the workshop. And she was basically saying it's not working. And she's an Air Force meteorologist. She had all kinds of weather equations written on the board, and it just was not working. And so one thing that you can do, and one thing that I like to do, is take a break from the game, because if you're overly saturated in it, or if you're very attached to some of the mechanics that you've just built in and really want to work, then your judgment's probably going to be a little bit clouded when you're evaluating how do I approach this from a different angle. So taking a break can be really great if you have the time to do it. Also, talking to other people. 2 brains are better than 1. So she came to me and I started throwing all of these ideas at her, just based on other games that I'd played. And then again, just going and playing games and building up that pool of knowledge of other mechanics. And then just trial and error, try it out, go back to the design board after you've taken a break, and bring other people in when you can.
Yeah, and I'll probably just say 2 or 3 sentences. So in an ideal world, you'll see this train wreck coming, and you stop it before it runs off said cliff or into the other oncoming train or whatever you want to end that analogy with. That's if you're really lucky and perhaps really good at going back to a client and saying, yeah, we're not going to do this, or this won't work in any conceivable fashion. Let's try to figure out how to make this work. Most of the time, we're not that lucky or that good. When I've seen some of our former exercises going down that path where it just wasn't going to work as conceived or as envisioned, I guess more precisely. I think you have to get your partner organization, your client, prepared to accept the fact that failure occurs, as long as you can spin it to, as Scott and Caitlin were saying, into a positive. Yeah, that went off the rails. Great. Hey, what do we learn? We learned how to not do that again. And then we enshrine that in our internal after-action reports. Don't do that. That's bad. But then, particularly with wargaming in a professional sense, with wicked problems, there isn't an easy win, so the possibility of failure is always high. Students in particular not capturing the essence or rationale behind the exercise is a real possibility. And so you hopefully get to work with clients and partners that accept that fact and are willing to take a risk anyway. And then come back the next year and we do it differently.
Great question. Any other questions? So just to prompt minds, I'll go to our backup slide here. We're happy to talk. We still have a few minutes left in the presentation here. Happy to talk topics, mechanics, purposes, or anything else anybody has.
Or if you have an idea for a game and want to bounce around some mechanics ideas or something like that. Yeah.
How did you guys end up in these roles? Is that not something to talk about?
Oh, no, we certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I briefly said it earlier, but I got a phone call from a friend who was working at NDU and said, we're starting a new division, we want you, can you work for an asshole for 9 months? And I just happened to be at the right place, at the right time, each time my boss left, where, if nothing else, they were desperate enough to say, well, okay, you can have it. So that's what got me here to my position today.
So I come from a history and poli-sci background in security policy studies, and longtime gamer in many aspects of life. And when I was in my undergraduate and graduate program, I did a lot of gaming at my university for kind of a couple of different purposes, and came across Castle, and when there was an opening, applied, and I've been there since for about the last 5 years.
So my background is in geopolitics, terrorism, and WMD studies. And I was really interested in strategy in undergrad, mostly strategy around conflicts, not necessarily just military strategy, but also kind of the higher level, like political as well. And one of my professors told me about wargaming. I'd never heard of it before. But I basically made it my mission after that to do as many internships as possible that had anything to do with game design, scenario writing, exercise design, anything like that. I interned with the military a couple times, and I found the position my last year of graduate school on USA Jobs. I applied, it actually worked, and I ended up here.
Any other kind of questions? Yeah, all the way in the back.
Great question.
I'm hearing Rochelle saying I work in cyber operations, and I'm just a graduate. I'm working on a wargaming series for cyber resilience for OT.
Yeah, nice. So it really depends, and as with kind of all things in wargaming, it depends a lot about your purpose and the level of analysis you're talking. I think at the lower end of the spectrum, there's still a lot of work to be done in figuring out exactly how the sort of tactical operations of cyber are gamed, in a technically accurate way that matches the level of fidelity that we can normally do with sort of force-on-force kinetic wargaming that is very detailed and very rich. The realm most of us work in is at the sort of strategic and the high strategic level. And, you know, I put this in here partially as a joke because we get this a lot for sort of that high strategic game. Well, can we do a strategic cyber game? Well, that's a strategic game that the players might use some cyber or face some cyber challenges, because it's really just one more tool in the toolkit that both you and your opponent are using against each other. There's a lot we can do in terms of setting up the scenario and setting up injects and setting up information so that even at a very high strategic game, players are tackling cyber issues and discussing the use of cyber tools, but fundamentally, it's still a strategic game in the context of another thing. I'm sorry, I'm just going to give one quick anecdote. One of the things we have interns at Castle, and one of the tasks we have them do is they either design or modify a commercial off-the-shelf game to kind of look at something that they studied while they were interning. We had an intern who was very interested in nuclear operations, and he took a commercial off-the-shelf war game, a modern, one of the Next War series, and added a whole lot more richness to the potential for tactical nuclear exchange in it. My colleagues and I sat down, and we were kind of chatting with each other beforehand. We said, "Oh, we're smart people. None of us would ever use a tactical nuke in any of this kind of scenario because escalation and bad diplomatic things that occur in this commercial off-the-shelf war game and the module he had designed for it." But as we actually started playing, and one of my teammates made a grave error, and there was the enemy was taking significant advantage of it, I actually started scratching my chin going like, that looks like a tempting target there for that capability. And so that's, to me, kind of the thing about cyber is it has to be contextualized in the decisions that are going on elsewhere, both the risks that you're taking by doing it and the opportunities that you have if you do use it. So without that kind of larger context, a cyber game by itself isn't that useful, except at the very kind of tactical level.
So also happy to talk to you after, just by nature of the time, because I think we had another question up front.
Yeah.
Are there any other government organizations or non-government organizations or private organizations that do what you guys do?
Absolutely. Government.
But we do it the best.
Yes. Seconded. Very, very kind of quickly, kind of throwing out a whole bunch of acronyms at you. A lot of organizations in the DoD do it. However, frequently it's called, the positions are often ones that look like operations research or exercise planner or something like that. All of the big contracting companies, Booz-Allen Hamilton, SAIC, Leidos, all of those have huge wargaming practices in them. The FFRDCs, so RAND, CNA, IDA, MITRE, have gaming groups within them, or people who will work in gaming, who will occasionally do games as product for them. Outside of government and sort of the government-associated national security sphere, there's a lot of academic organizations that either do game studies, game education, or there's a few places that do game design. And those are kind of the ones off the top of my head, but happy to talk more offline.
Plug for the National Endowment of the Arts and National Endowment for Science. They both also, for any game designers out in the room, they also offer not insignificant grants. I mean, you're not going to get rich because, government grants are hard to come by and they're not all that well funded in most cases. But they both fund grants for educational games in development, usually for K through 12, but that's not a hard and fast.
Any last questions from folks? Well, thank you for sticking with us through this. I hope you all enjoyed it and learned some stuff. If you're interested in hearing a little bit more about sort of some specific history we have a presentation tomorrow called Wargaming Past, Present, and Future, where we'll talk very briefly about the history of wargaming, talk a little bit about a few of the sort of types that we've discussed today, and talk a little bit about where we see some of the trajectories of the field headed, and then of course have enough time for Q&A. Hope to see at least some of you there, and enjoy the rest of MAGFest. My colleagues and I will be out and happy to kind of chat and answer any questions one-on-one that weren't able to be answered here. Thank you.